Sarah. I heard that voice in the middle of the grocery store. My hand froze over a jar of pasta sauce, because the man who had just spoken was my husband. The same husband I buried 6 months ago. Slowly I turned my head. 3 aisles away, a man with gray hair and broad shoulders was standing near the soup shelf, comparing labels the way he had done every Sunday for 40 years. Mark. My husband. The man whose name was carved into a headstone in Oakridge Cemetery. My heart stopped, because if my husband was standing in that grocery store, then who was buried in his grave? Before I tell you what happened next, I'm really glad you're here. If stories like this interest you, take a second to subscribe and like the video, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. That morning felt painfully normal. 6 months had passed since the funeral, and the house had finally settled into a kind of quiet I was slowly learning to live with. Not a peaceful quiet. Nothing about grief ever becomes peaceful, but a quieter rhythm than the first months had been. In the beginning, every room had echoed with absence. Every object reminded me of Mark. His reading glasses still sat beside the chair he used every evening. His favorite mug remained in the cabinet, the blue one with the chipped handle he refused to throw away. For weeks I could not bring myself to move any of it. I left his jacket hanging by the door. I left his tools exactly where he had last placed them in the garage. Even his slippers remained beside the bed on his side, as if one evening he might simply walk back into the room and slide his feet into them again. Grief makes you do strange things. You begin to protect memories the way people protect fragile glass, afraid that if you move anything, everything might shatter. But time, stubborn as always, kept moving forward. The refrigerator still needed to be filled. The trash still had to be taken out. Mail still arrived every afternoon like nothing extraordinary had happened in my life. That morning I stood in the kitchen holding the last carton of milk and staring into a refrigerator that looked almost empty. It felt strange to realize that grief did not stop ordinary problems. You could lose the person you loved for 40 years and still wake up needing groceries. I remember standing there longer than necessary, trying to decide whether I had the energy to go out. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the ticking of the clock above the stove. Tick, tick, tick. 6 months earlier that same clock had ticked through the night after the police officer knocked on my door. I had sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing while Ryan tried to explain what the officer had told him about the accident. But that morning the memory felt slightly farther away. Not gone, just softer. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out through the window into the backyard. The oak tree Mark had planted 30 years earlier stood there exactly the same as always, its branches moving slightly in the wind. For a moment I allowed myself to think something that almost felt like betrayal. Maybe I was finally starting to adjust. Not heal. That word felt too large. But adjust. The sadness was still there, living quietly in the background of everything. It followed me through the rooms of the house like a shadow. But it no longer crushed my chest the way it had during those first terrible weeks. I could breathe again. That alone felt like progress. Eventually I stood up, rinsed my coffee cup, grabbed my purse and put on my coat. Groceries, I said out loud to the empty kitchen, as if announcing the task might give it more weight. The drive to the market in Cedar Ridge took about 10 minutes. It was the same small grocery store Mark and I had been visiting for decades. The same cracked parking lot with faded white lines and shopping carts scattered near the entrance. The automatic doors opened with their usual soft mechanical sigh when I walked inside. Nothing had changed. Mrs. Delgado from the bakery stood behind the glass counter arranging fresh bread into neat rows. When she saw me, she raised her hand in greeting. "Morning, Sarah," she called warmly. "Good to see you." I smiled politely. People had been extra gentle with me since the funeral. Their kindness was sincere, but sometimes it made the emptiness feel heavier. Every soft voice reminded me that everyone knew I was now the woman who had lost her husband. Near the entrance, a teenage cashier was stacking soda cans into a display tower that leaned dangerously to one side. Every time he added another row, he stepped back and examined it carefully like an architect inspecting a building. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the small machine near the checkout counter. Everything felt ordinary. Comfortingly ordinary. I grabbed a basket and began walking slowly through the aisles. Bread, eggs, coffee, pasta, Small things that made a quiet house feel a little less empty. As I moved through the store, I noticed something surprising inside myself. For the first time in months, I did not feel like I was drowning in grief. The sadness was still there, of course. It always would be. But it had softened enough that I could think about other things again. About bills, about the garden, about the way the house needed repainting before winter. It was strange how quickly the mind tried to rebuild normal life. I remember thinking, almost cautiously, that maybe life was finally starting to feel manageable again. Not happy, but manageable. That word kept returning to me. Manageable mornings. Manageable afternoons. Manageable silence. I had no idea that within minutes everything I believed about my husband's death was about to collapse. Because while I stood in the canned goods aisle, reaching for a jar of pasta sauce, I heard something that made my entire body go cold. A familiar cough, followed by a quiet voice complaining under its breath. And the moment I heard it, I knew. I was standing in the canned goods aisle when I heard it. A familiar cough. Short, dry, followed by a quiet complaint spoken under someone's breath. $3 for soup? That's ridiculous. My body reacted before my mind did. My fingers tightened around the jar of pasta sauce I was holding. For a second I thought I might drop it. Because I knew that voice. Not just the sound of it. The rhythm. The irritation in the last word. The way he always complained about prices even when he was the one insisting on buying the better brands. For 41 years I had listened to that exact tone. I had heard it in kitchens, parking lots, hardware stores, and every grocery aisle in Cedar Ridge. Usually on Sundays, Mark treated grocery shopping like a serious responsibility. He compared labels carefully, checked expiration dates like a detective searching for evidence, and complained about prices as if the entire food industry had been created personally to frustrate him. My chest tightened. My fingers went numb. Because that voice belonged to a man who was supposed to be dead. Slowly, very slowly, I turned my head. 3 aisles away, a man with gray hair stood beside the soup shelf holding a red can in his hand. Broad shoulders. A slightly stooped posture. The same dark jacket Mark wore for errands every winter. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it made my vision blur. Mark. It was him. Not someone who looked like him. Not someone who vaguely resembled him from across the store. It was him. The same silver hair that never stayed flat in the back no matter how often he brushed it. The same scar above his right eyebrow from the latter accident 20 years earlier when he insisted he could repair the roof without calling anyone. The same way he tilted his head slightly when reading small print. For a moment the rest of the store disappeared. The fluorescent lights hummed above. A cart rattled past somewhere behind me. Someone laughed near the dairy section. But all I could see was the man standing in that aisle. Alive. Alive. My husband, whose funeral I attended 6 months ago. My hand loosened. The jar slipped from my fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp crack and shattered, red sauce splashing across the white tile like something alive. A woman nearby gasped. Oh my God. Ma'am, are you okay? Someone asked. But I barely heard them. My feet were already moving. One step, then another. Each step felt unreal, as if I were walking through water. My heart pounded violently in my chest. I was suddenly aware of every small detail. The smell of tomatoes from the broken jar. The squeak of my shoes against the tile. The sound of my breathing too loud in my ears. I walked slowly down the aisle toward him, afraid that if I moved too quickly he might vanish. Mark turned slightly as I approached. For one impossible second hope surged inside me. Maybe the police had made a mistake. Maybe the accident report had been wrong. Maybe the body they found wasn't his. Maybe everything I had been told for the last 6 months had simply been a terrible misunderstanding. Because the man standing there looked perfectly fine. Healthy. Alive. He looked exactly the way he had the last morning he left the house. But another thought followed immediately behind that hope. If Mark was alive, then the man buried in Oakridge Cemetery was someone else. And that meant one terrifying thing. Everything I believed about my husband's death might be a lie. I stopped a few feet away from him, close enough now to see the faint lines beside his mouth, close enough to notice the familiar watch on his wrist, the one Ryan had given him for his 60th birthday. My hands were shaking. Mark, I said softly. The word felt fragile in my mouth, like something that might break if spoken too loudly. He looked up. Our eyes met. And for a brief moment, so brief I almost believed I imagined it, I saw something flash across his face. Recognition. A pause. A tightening around his eyes. Then it vanished. His expression shifted into polite confusion. The kind of expression someone gives a stranger who has mistaken them for someone else. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. His voice was exactly the same deep tone, the same calm steadiness I had listened to for 4 decades. "My name isn't Mark." The word struck my chest like ice. "I think you have me confused with someone else." For a moment I simply stared at him. 41 years of marriage stood between us. 41 years of shared mornings, arguments, road trips, holidays, quiet dinners, and ordinary days. And he was looking at me like I was a stranger. "No," I whispered. My voice barely worked. "That's not possible." He shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable now. Around us the grocery store continued its ordinary rhythm. An employee arrived with a mop to clean the broken jar. A woman pushed her cart past the aisle without looking at us. But the world I knew had already cracked open. Because standing in front of me was my husband. Alive. Breathing. Looking directly at me. And pretending he had never seen me before. My hands began to shake the same way they had 6 months earlier. Fear does something strange to memory. It opens doors you thought were locked forever. Standing there in that grocery aisle, staring at the man who looked exactly like my dead husband, my mind was suddenly pulled backward in time. Back to the day everything changed. It had been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen folding laundry when the phone rang. At first I almost didn't answer. Telemarketers had been calling constantly that week, and I remember thinking I would let the machine pick it up. But something made me reach for the phone. "Hello." The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. "Mrs. Collins?" the man asked. "Yes. This is Officer Daniel Reeves with the Colorado State Police." For a moment I didn't understand what he was saying. My mind tried to place the words somewhere familiar, somewhere harmless. Then he said the sentence that divided my life into 2 parts. "There has been an accident." Even now, remembering it, I can feel the cold that spread through my chest. He explained that a vehicle registered to my husband had been involved in a highway crash outside Denver. The damage to the car, he said gently, had been severe. Very severe. I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen counter because my knees suddenly felt weak. "What hospital?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he said the words no wife ever wants to hear. "I'm very sorry, ma'am." The officer explained that the collision had caused a fire. The vehicle had been almost completely destroyed. Identification had been made through the vehicle registration and personal belongings found inside. They recommended a closed casket funeral. At the time I didn't question anything. I was too shocked. Too broken. Mark and I had been married 41 years. 41 years of shared routines. 41 years of building a life together piece by piece. We started with almost nothing. A small apartment above a hardware store and a second-hand pickup truck that Mark swore would last forever. Over the years we built a marina supply business near the river. Nothing glamorous but steady. Honest work. Long hours. We raised our son Ryan in that same town. Ryan had always been close to his father. They worked together at the shop almost every summer once he turned 16. When the police called, Ryan was the first person I called after I hung up. He arrived at the house less than 20 minutes later. I still remember the look on his face when I opened the door. Shock. Fear. But also something else I didn't understand at the time. Something guarded. He held me while I cried. Helped make the phone calls that followed. Helped arrange the funeral. Ryan handled almost everything. At the time I was grateful. Grief leaves you unable to think clearly. You depend on other people to make decisions. Ryan spoke with the police. Ryan spoke with the funeral director. Ryan took care of the paperwork. I remember standing beside him at the funeral while rain tapped softly against the umbrellas around us. The casket remained closed, just like they recommended. People came from all over town. Friends. Customers from the marina shop. Neighbors who had known Mark for decades. Everyone said the same things. He was a good man. You had a beautiful marriage. He'll be missed. Ryan stood beside me the entire time, holding my hand. "Everything will be okay, Mom," he told me quietly. I believed him. Back then, I believed everything. But now, standing in a grocery store aisle staring at the man I had buried 6 months earlier, one terrible question began forming in my mind. What if none of it had been true? The first crack appeared that same night. After leaving the grocery store, I drove home slowly, barely aware of the road in front of me. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers had turned pale. My mind kept replaying the same image over and over again. Mark standing in the canned goods aisle, alive, looking at me like I was a stranger. By the time I reached the house, the sun had already begun to set. The quiet inside felt heavier than usual. For months that silence had belonged to grief. Now it belonged to something else. Fear. I placed my groceries on the kitchen counter but didn't unpack them. Instead, I sat down at the table and stared at my phone for a long time. There was only one person I could call. Ryan. My son answered on the third ring. "Hey, Mom," he said. His voice sounded normal. Too normal. "Ryan," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. "Something strange happened today." "What do you mean?" "I saw your father." The silence on the line lasted just a little too long. Then Ryan sighed softly. "Mom." "I'm serious," I continued quickly. "I saw him in the grocery store. At Cedar Ridge Market. He was standing right there in the soup aisle." Ryan spoke again, but something in his tone made my stomach twist. "Mom, grief can do strange things to people." The words sounded prepared. Careful. Like something someone says when they have practiced the sentence before. "I know what I saw," I replied. "You've been under a lot of stress," he said gently. The mind sometimes fills in things when we're still processing loss. Processing loss. The phrase sounded clinical. Cold. And suddenly I realized something that made my skin prickle. Ryan had not asked a single question. Not one. He hadn't asked what the man looked like. Hadn't asked where I saw him. Hadn't asked what happened. Instead, he immediately explained it away. "Mom," he continued calmly, "you've been alone a lot lately. It's easy to think you recognize someone when you're missing Dad." My stomach tightened. For a moment I didn't speak. "Ryan," I said quietly, "if you saw someone who looked exactly like your father, wouldn't you at least want to know more?" Another pause. Then he cleared his throat. "I just don't want you upsetting yourself over something that isn't real." That was the moment the first real doubt appeared. Not about what I had seen. About him. We ended the call a few minutes later. Ryan promised to come by later that week to check on me. But after I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the dark screen of my phone. Something about that conversation didn't feel right. Over the next few days, small details began to surface. Things I had ignored before. Ryan suddenly seemed to have access to money he never had before. He had taken control of the company accounts after Mark's accident, explaining that someone needed to handle the finances while I recovered. At the time it had seemed reasonable. Now it felt different. Ryan had always struggled financially. Even as an adult, he never seemed to hold on to money for long. Mark and I often helped him quietly when things became difficult. But recently he had purchased a new truck. A nice one. Too nice. When I asked him about it a week earlier, he laughed and said business had been good. At the time I believed him. Now that memory sat in my mind like a loose thread. Then something else happened. 3 days after the grocery store incident, I was standing outside watering the plants near the fence when my neighbor, Mrs. Hanley, walked past. She slowed when she saw me. "Sarah," she said, "can I ask you something strange?" "Of course." She hesitated, clearly unsure whether to continue. "Well, this might sound ridiculous." "What is it?" Mrs. Hanley looked toward the street as if making sure no one else was listening. "About 2 months ago, I thought I saw Mark's truck driving through town. The watering can slipped slightly in my hand." "You must be mistaken," I said automatically. "That's what I thought too," she replied quickly. "I mean, of course it couldn't have been him." She gave a nervous little laugh. "But it really looked like his truck. Same color. Same dent on the rear bumper." I felt a slow chill spread through my chest. Mark's truck had been destroyed in the accident. That was what the police report said. Mrs. Hanley shifted awkwardly. I almost waved. she continued. Then I remembered, well, she didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she patted my arm gently and continued down the sidewalk. But I remained standing there long after she left. The watering can hung loosely in my hand, because suddenly the impossible possibility that had terrified me in the grocery store no longer felt quite so impossible. The pieces were beginning to move. And for the first time, a far more frightening thought formed quietly in my mind. What if Ryan already knew? What if my son hadn't sounded calm on the phone because he thought I was imagining things, but because he already knew the truth? The next day I went back to the grocery store. I told myself it was foolish. That grief and shock had probably twisted my memory. That if I returned and the man wasn't there, I could finally accept that my mind had played a cruel trick on me. But deep down I already knew the truth. I hadn't imagined it. I arrived at Cedar Ridge Market just before noon, parking in almost the exact same spot where I had parked the day before. The sky hung low and gray that morning, and the air carried the heavy stillness that comes before rain. I didn't go inside. Instead, I stayed in the car. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the entrance. The automatic glass doors opened and closed again and again as people came and went with their carts. I watched every face. An elderly couple walked out slowly, arguing quietly about coupons. A young mother struggled to carry a toddler and 2 grocery bags at the same time. A delivery driver rolled a cart of boxes through the entrance while whistling to himself. Normal life. Ordinary people. Minutes passed. Then 20. Then 40. Sitting there began to feel ridiculous. My back started to ache from the position, and my hands rested nervously on the steering wheel. More than once I nearly started the engine and drove away. What if I had been wrong? What if I had embarrassed myself for nothing? But something inside me refused to leave. A quiet voice kept repeating the same thought. You saw him. You know what you saw. Nearly an hour passed. And then the doors opened again. My breath caught. He stepped outside. The same man. The same shoulders. The same familiar walk I could have recognized from across a crowded room. Mark. He carried 2 grocery bags in one hand and paused near the curb for a moment. Then he did something so small, so ordinary that my chest tightened instantly. He adjusted the watch on his wrist. Mark had done that thousands of times during our marriage. The strap always sat slightly loose, and he would tighten it absent-mindedly whenever it slid down too far. I had teased him about that habit for years. Maybe you just need a new watch, I once told him. But he refused. Ryan gave me this one, he said proudly. Watching that small gesture now made my stomach twist, because there was no doubt left. It was him. My husband. Alive. My heart began pounding so loudly that I could feel it in my throat. I lowered slightly in my seat, afraid he might look in my direction. Mark walked across the parking lot and placed the grocery bags carefully into the trunk of a gray sedan. It wasn't his truck. Mark had loved that truck. He washed it every weekend like it was a prized possession. But this car was different. Older. The paint had faded slightly under the sun, and there was a small dent near the rear door. He closed the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine started. The car pulled slowly out of the parking lot. For a moment I hesitated. Following someone felt wrong. Felt invasive. But letting him disappear felt worse. So I started my car. I stayed several vehicles behind him as we drove through town. Every turn felt surreal. These were streets Mark and I had driven together hundreds of times. Past the post office. Past the gas station where he always insisted on checking the tire pressure. Past the small park where Ryan had learned to ride his first bicycle. But now I felt like a stranger moving through my own memories. After about 15 minutes, Mark turned onto a quiet road near the edge of Cedar Ridge. The houses there were older. Small wooden homes with wide yards and tall trees leaning over the sidewalks. He slowed his car and pulled into the driveway of a pale yellow house. It looked modest but well kept. A small garden sat beside the front porch, and wind chimes moved softly in the breeze. I parked halfway down the street, careful not to be noticed. From where I sat, I could see the front door clearly. Mark stepped out of the car and lifted the grocery bags from the trunk. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped outside. She looked younger than me by at least 10 years. Dark hair pulled back into a loose knot. She wore a sweater and jeans, the kind of clothes people wear when they are comfortable inside their own homes. She smiled when she saw him. Not a polite smile. Familiar one. The kind of smile people share when they see someone they love. She walked down the steps and took one of the grocery bags from his hands. Then 2 small children burst out of the doorway behind her. A boy and a girl. 8, maybe 9 years old. They ran straight toward him. "Grandpa!" the little girl shouted. The word echoed across the quiet street. And then something happened that shattered the last piece of doubt I had been holding on to. Mark laughed. That same deep, warm laugh I had heard for 40 years. The laugh that once filled our kitchen. The laugh that had comforted me during difficult years. The laugh of my husband. The man I had buried. He crouched down and opened his arms as the children crashed into him, wrapping their arms around his neck. The woman watched them, smiling softly. Her hand rested gently on his back, like it belonged there, like it had been there for a long time. And sitting in my car, watching that quiet scene unfold, I realized something that made my entire body go cold. My husband hadn't just survived the accident. He had been living another life. A completely different life. Without me. I did not confront him that day. Every nerve in my body wanted to run to that house, pound on the door, and demand an answer. I wanted to drag the truth into the street and force it to breathe in daylight. But something inside me, something colder and steadier than grief, told me not to move too soon. If Mark had faked his death, then this was no accident, no panic, no temporary madness. It was a plan. And if it was a plan, then I needed proof. I drove home in a daze, but this time I did not sit in the kitchen and cry. I sat at my desk and wrote everything down. The time he left the grocery store. The make and color of the car. The address of the pale yellow house. The woman. The children. The word the little girl had shouted. "Grandpa." My hand trembled as I wrote it. Then I opened the drawer where Mark kept old business files and took out the checkbook register Ryan had helped me sort through after the funeral. I started flipping pages, and the more I looked, the more sick I felt. There were transfers I did not remember approving. Small ones at first. Then larger ones. Company funds moved in the weeks before the accident. Personal accounts reduced in quiet, careful amounts. Not enough to attract immediate attention. Just enough to disappear if no one looked too closely. And I had not looked. Because I had been grieving a dead man. The next morning I drove to Denver and met with a private investigator named Alan Mercer. He was recommended by a lawyer a friend of mine had once used during a property dispute, and he had the kind of face that revealed very little. I sat across from him and told him everything. The accident. The closed casket. The grocery store. The house. My son's strange reaction. Alan did not interrupt me once. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked only one question. "Do you want the truth, Mrs. Collins, or do you want reassurance?" "The truth," I said. He nodded. "Then be prepared for it." Those words stayed with me over the next 2 weeks. Because once Alan began digging, the lies started surfacing faster than I could bear them. Mark had been using another name. He had rented that pale yellow house months before the so-called accident. There were hidden bank accounts in 2 states. A second driver's license. Utility bills. Insurance documents. And then came the worst discovery of all. Phone records. Repeated calls between Mark and Ryan in the weeks leading up to the crash. Not ordinary calls. Dozens of them. Late at night. Early in the morning. Long enough to plan something. Careful enough to hide it. Alan placed the records in front of me without speaking. I stared at them until the numbers blurred. My own son. Not merely aware. Involved. That was the moment something inside me finally hardened. Not my grief. Not my anger. My clarity. I hired an attorney the same day. 3 months later, the truth came into the open in a courtroom packed with strangers, reporters, and a few people from Cedar Ridge who could not resist scandal when it arrived wearing a familiar face. Mark sat at the defense table in a dark suit, looking older than I remembered. Ryan sat beside his own attorney, pale and exhausted. I did not look at either of them for long. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and old air conditioning. Everything felt too ordinary for what was happening. At first Mark denied everything. He claimed I had misunderstood. Claimed he had intended to return one day. claimed the false identity was temporary, and the financial transfers were business protections. Then Alan took the stand. He presented the documents one by one: the lease agreement, the false identification, the hidden accounts, the timeline proving Mark had arranged his second life long before the accident. The room grew quieter with each page. But the final blow came when the investigator played the recordings. Phone calls. Mark's voice. Ryan's voice. Clear enough that no one in the room could pretend otherwise. They discussed the staged death, the money, the transfer of assets, how long they thought I would remain too overwhelmed to ask questions. At the first recording, Ryan went white. At the second, he lowered his head into his hands. At the third, he broke. He started crying there in the courtroom. Not like a child, not like a man asking forgiveness, but like someone who had finally realized there was nowhere left to hide. The entire room fell silent. Even Mark stopped looking at his lawyer. For the first time in 41 years, I saw him without the protection of marriage, routine, or memory. Just a man. A frightened, dishonest man who had built 2 lives and deserved neither. And beside him sat my son, the boy I had raised, the man who helped bury an empty lie and called it love. I did not cry. Not then. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, and listened as the truth finished speaking for all of us. The courtroom went silent after Ryan started crying. Not the kind of quiet that comes from respect. It was the heavy silence that follows when a truth becomes too large for the room holding it. Ryan's shoulders shook as he tried to breathe. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, but the words seemed to slide past him without meaning. Across the room, Mark sat very still. He stared down at the table in front of him, his hands folded together as if he were simply waiting for a meeting to end. For 41 years I had believed I knew that man. I knew the way he liked his coffee, the songs he hummed while fixing things in the garage, the stories he told about his childhood. I believed I understood his quiet moods and the way he avoided conflict. I believed that silence was simply part of who he was. But sitting there in that courtroom watching him refuse to look up, I realized something painful and strangely freeing. I had never truly known him at all. The judge called for order, his voice firm but controlled. Papers shuffled. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks. The investigator finished explaining the timeline of events. The evidence had become overwhelming. Fake identification documents, hidden bank accounts, financial transfers arranged before the crash. And the recordings. Those recordings had ended everything. Mark's attorney attempted one final argument, suggesting confusion, emotional pressure, poor judgment. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. The facts were too clear. Ryan eventually lifted his head. His face looked pale and exhausted, like someone who had been awake for days. For a brief moment his eyes moved across the courtroom and found me. Our gazes met. I expected to feel anger or heartbreak, but what I felt instead surprised me. Distance. A quiet, steady distance that had not existed before. I remembered the little boy who used to run through our backyard with scraped knees and grass stains. The boy who once climbed into my lap after nightmares and asked if monsters were real. That boy had trusted me. The man sitting in that courtroom had chosen something else. Greed, fear, or perhaps simply the easiest path. Whatever the reason, the son I had known was no longer there. Ryan lowered his eyes again. Mark never looked at me once. When the hearing ended, people slowly began leaving their seats. Conversation started quietly at first, then grew louder as the tension released itself into the air. Reporters rushed toward the hallway. Lawyers gathered their documents. The room filled with movement. I remained seated. My hands rested calmly in my lap, and for the first time in months I noticed something unexpected inside my chest. The pain that had dominated my life since the funeral was gone. Not erased, but changed. For 6 months I believed I had lost my husband in a terrible accident. I had mourned him, defended his memory, visited his grave. But the man who betrayed me in that courtroom was not the same man I had loved. That man, the one I married 41 years ago, existed only in memories now. And strangely enough, realizing that brought me peace. When I finally stood and walked toward the exit, I passed Ryan without stopping. He whispered something as I walked by. "Mom." His voice sounded small, but I didn't turn. Not out of cruelty. Simply because there was nothing left to say. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. People moved along the sidewalks as if the world had not just shifted for me. Cars passed. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Life continued. For the first time since the accident, I breathed deeply. And the air no longer felt heavy. The family I believed in had ended that day. But something else had begun. Something quieter. Something stronger. The beginning of a life that belonged entirely to me. The legal process took months. Courtrooms moved slowly, even when the truth is obvious. Documents had to be reviewed, accounts traced, and every piece of evidence placed neatly into its proper order. During that time, I returned to my house in Cedar Ridge and continued living quietly, almost the same way I had during the 6 months of mourning. Except now the silence in the house felt different. Before, the silence had been filled with loss. Now it was filled with clarity. For the first time in decades, I began to understand how much of my life had revolved around other people. Mark's routines, Ryan's problems, the business we had built together. I had spent years adjusting my days to fit the needs of others without ever asking myself what I truly wanted. The court eventually froze the hidden accounts Mark had created. Investigators were able to trace most of the money he and Ryan had moved before the staged accident. Some of it had already been spent, but much of it was recovered. Ryan accepted a plea deal for financial fraud and conspiracy. His attorney advised him that fighting the evidence would only make the outcome worse. Mark faced several charges connected to identity fraud, insurance deception, and financial manipulation. The details filled pages of legal documents. But when people later asked me about that period, I never remembered the paperwork. What I remembered instead was the moment I walked through my front door after the final hearing and realized something simple. The house no longer felt like a place of grief. It felt like a beginning. For weeks I moved slowly through the rooms, deciding what to keep and what to let go. I donated most of Mark's clothes. Not in anger. Just because they no longer belonged to my life. I repainted the kitchen a lighter color. I opened windows that had remained closed through the winter. I allowed sunlight to fill rooms that had once felt dark and heavy. Friends I had not seen in years began calling again. At first I hesitated to answer, embarrassed by everything that had happened. But eventually I agreed to meet them for coffee. Then dinner. Then small trips outside town. The world felt larger than it had in a long time. 6 months after the trial ended, I made another decision. I sold the house. It was not an easy choice. That house held 40 years of memories, some beautiful, some painful. But I realized something important. Memories do not live inside walls. They live inside us. I moved to a smaller place near the coast, somewhere the air smelled like salt and the mornings began with the sound of waves instead of traffic. For the first time since I was a young woman, my life belonged entirely to me. No one expected anything from me. No one needed me to hold their secrets or carry their mistakes. I began traveling. Small trips at first, then longer ones. Places Mark and I had once talked about visiting but never did because there was always work to finish or responsibilities waiting. I walked along quiet beaches in the early mornings. I read books in cafes where no one knew my name. I slept peacefully without the weight of unanswered questions. Sometimes people ask me if I hate Mark for what he did. I always tell them the same thing. Hate is heavy. And after everything that happened, I had no desire to carry anything heavy anymore. Mark lost both lives he tried to build. The one he abandoned, and the one he created with lies. As for Ryan, forgiveness is more complicated. A mother's heart does not simply close a door and walk away. But trust, once broken that deeply, cannot be rebuilt easily. We speak occasionally now. Carefully. Slowly. Like two people learning how to exist in a new reality. But my life no longer revolves around that relationship. My life belongs to me now. And strangely enough, everything that once felt like the end of my world became the moment my real life finally began. Sometimes the person you trust the most is the one hiding the biggest truth. For 41 years I believed I knew my husband completely. I believed love meant safety, loyalty, and shared direction. I believed the life we built together was exactly what it appeared to be. But life has a way of revealing truths we never imagined. What matters most is not the betrayal itself. It is what you choose to do after the truth finally appears. Even when someone breaks your trust, one thing always remains in your control. Your decision to stand up for yourself. Your decision to rebuild your life with dignity. Your decision to keep moving forward. Names and some details in this story have been changed for privacy. If you have ever experienced betrayal or deception like this, share your story in the comments. And if you want to hear more real-life stories like this one, subscribe and watch the next story on this channel, because sometimes the most unbelievable stories turn out to be true.